The clinic floor was cheap linoleum, the kind that held on to the smell of bleach and dried blood no matter how hard you scrubbed. When the suited men kicked through the frosted glass, they expected a terrified night nurse. They didn't expect a woman who knew exactly how to crush a trachea. The fluorescent bulb above the nurse's station had been humming a sharp, out-of-tune B-flat since November. Morgan barely heard it anymore. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of dead-hour quiet where the city outside stopped pretending it was alive. Inside the Free Street Clinic, the air was thick, heavy with the competing odors of industrial ammonia, stale Folgers coffee, and the metallic, sour tang of old sweat. Morgan leaned against the scratched laminate counter, pressing the heel of her hand into her right eye socket. Her lower back throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache that kept time with her pulse. She was 32, but her joints felt 50. Taking a slow breath, she reached for a roll of medical tape. Her fingers, calloused and pale under the harsh lighting, fumbled for a second, a slight tremor in her left hand. She stared at it, annoyed, willing the shaking to stop. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't caffeine. It was the neurological ghost of a roadside in Helmand, an echo of a shock wave that had rattled her brain against her skull 7 years ago. "Stop it!" she muttered, snapping the tape and wrapping it tightly around a bundle of gauze. The clinic was empty, save for a transient named Gary sleeping off a fever in bed 3. Morgan liked the night shift. It was mostly stitching up drunk college students who fell off curbs or handing out antibiotics. It was predictable. It was safe. The hardest decision she usually made was whether to throw out the break room milk. She turned to file a stack of damp, dog-eared intake forms when the heavy glass front doors rattled. Morgan didn't look up immediately. The doors were locked. Protocol meant you buzzed in through the intercom. But the rattling didn't stop. It escalated into a violent, desperate shaking, followed by the dull thud of a heavy boot against the reinforced frame. The lock held for exactly 3 seconds. The glass didn't shatter. It was safety-paned. But the deadbolt tore straight through the cheap aluminum doorframe with a sickening screech of yielding metal. The doors blew open, dragging in a gust of damp, freezing rain and the harsh glare of street lamps. 3 men stumbled into the waiting room. Morgan's breath hitched just for a fraction of a second before her training, the deep, muscular conditioning she had spent years trying to bury, snapped into place. Her posture shifted. The slouch vanished. Her eyes darted, cataloguing the intruders in less time than it took to blink. The man in the center was the problem. He was dripping wet, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than the clinic's annual budget, but the left side of his jacket was heavy, slick, and black with blood. He was leaning heavily on a mountain of a man in a cheap leather jacket, the muscle. Behind them came the leader. He stepped over the ruined door frame with an unsettling calmness. His shoes clicked sharply against the linoleum. He was tall, thin, wearing an overcoat unbuttoned to reveal a silk tie. His hair was slicked back, untouched by the rain. He looked out of place among the peeling paint and faded health warning posters. He radiated a cold, entitled authority. The street called his syndicate a lot of things, whispers of international ties and ruthless expansion. But looking at his pale, angular face, Morgan just saw another man used to taking up too much space. "Where's the doctor?" the leader asked. His voice was smooth, carrying a slight rasp. "There's no doctor on duty," Morgan said. Her voice was flat, neutral. She didn't press the silent panic button under the desk. Not yet. Her eyes stayed locked on the leader's hands. His right hand was resting casually inside his coat pocket. A heavy sag in the fabric. A weapon. "You're lying," the heavy man in the leather jacket barked. He dragged the bleeding man forward, leaving a thick, dark smear across the freshly mopped floor. Morgan felt a flash of deep, irrational irritation. "I just bleached that." "It's a free clinic," Morgan said, stepping out from behind the counter. She kept her hands visible, palms open, resting at waist height. A pacifying gesture, a tactical ready stance. "The doctor leaves at midnight. I'm the night nurse." The bleeding man groaned, his knees buckling. He slipped onto the plastic waiting room chairs, his head lolling back. Blood was pooling rapidly on the plastic, dripping onto the floor with a rhythmic pat, pat, pat. The leader tilted his head, studying Morgan. His eyes were dark, dead things. "Then you'll have to do. Fix him." Morgan walked slowly toward the chairs. As she closed the distance, the smell hit her. It wasn't just blood. It was the sharp, acrid scent of perforated bowel. The man had been shot in the gut, low and left. Messy. "He needs a trauma center," Morgan said, stopping 6 feet away. "I have basic supplies here. Suture kits, saline, low-grade painkillers. I can't do surgery." The leader sighed, a soft, disappointed sound. He pulled his right hand from his coat. The fluorescent light caught the dull, brushed steel of a suppressed 9mm pistol. He didn't point it at her immediately. He just let it hang by his side, an absolute declaration of control. "My name is Vincent," he said softly. "This is my brother, Lucas, and if his heart stops beating in this filthy little room, yours will too. So, nurse, I suggest you find a way to do surgery." Morgan stared at the gun. Her stomach twisted, a cold, greasy nausea pooling in her gut. She hated guns. She hated the weight of them, the noise of them, the absolute, arrogant finality of them. Her heart rate began to climb, a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. Adrenaline flooded her system, making the back of her neck prickle. It wasn't a heroic surge of power. It felt like poison. "Bring him to Trauma Room 1, Morgan said, her voice dropping an octave, stripping away the polite customer service tone. "End of the hall. Now." The trauma room was barely larger than a walk-in closet, dominated by a steel gurney and a rolling tray of stainless instruments. The lighting was better here, stark, bright, and unforgiving. Wyatt, the heavy man, dumped Lucas onto the gurney. Lucas screamed, a wet, tearing sound that echoed off the tiled walls. His skin was the color of old wax, coated in a fine sheen of cold sweat. "Hold him down," Morgan ordered, grabbing a pair of heavy trauma shears. She didn't wait for permission. She drove the blunt edge of the shears under the expensive wool of Lucas's suit pants and ripped upward. The fabric gave way, exposing the wound. It was worse than she thought. The entry was small, a neat little puckered hole just above the hip bone, but it was bubbling. A steady rhythmic pulse of bright red arterial blood mixed with the darker, thicker ooze of venous bleeding. The bullet had nicked an artery and tumbled into the intestines. Morgan pressed her gloved hands directly into the wound, bearing down with her body weight. Lucas thrashed wildly, his spine arching off the table. "I said hold him down!" Morgan snapped, her shoulder slamming into Wyatt's chest as he hesitated. Wyatt scowled, grabbing Lucas's shoulders and pinning him. Vincent stood in the doorway, watching. He hadn't put the gun away. "I need clamps," Morgan said, her jaw tight. "On the tray, the silver things that look like scissors. Give them to me." Vincent didn't move. He gestured with his chin to Wyatt. Wyatt reached over with one massive hand, fumbling with the sterile tray. He grabbed a pair of hemostats and shoved them toward her. Morgan kept the pressure with her left hand, feeling the slippery, hot pulse of the artery beneath her fingertips. It was like trying to pinch a wet, live worm. "You." She looked at Vincent. "I need you to hold the retractors. I have to open the wound track to clamp the bleeder." Vincent sneered, a look of pure disgust crossing his immaculate features. "I don't touch the meat. You do it. If I let go, he bleeds out in 90 seconds, Morgan said, her voice devoid of panic, presenting a simple, mathematical fact. "Get over here." Vincent's eyes narrowed. He took a step into the room, raising the pistol, aiming it directly at the bridge of Morgan's nose. "Don't give me orders, bitch. Fix him." The muzzle was inches from her face. Morgan could smell the faint trace of gun oil and burnt cordite. Time seemed to downshift. The frantic thrashing of the dying man beneath her hands, the panicked hum of the overhead lights, the ragged breathing of the massive goon beside her, it all slowed to a crawl. Morgan felt an old, familiar coldness seep into her chest. It was the absolute absence of empathy. The switch flipping. She didn't want this. She had spent years unlearning the violence, going to therapy, learning to breathe through the nightmares, dedicating her hands to healing flesh instead of tearing it. But looking down the barrel of Vincent's gun, the nurse vanished. The Marine woke up. She catalogued the environment with clinical precision. Threat 1, Vincent. Armed, standing just out of arm's reach, center of balance shifted backward. Confident but complacent. Threat 2, Wyatt. Unarmed in hand, likely packing under the jacket. Currently distracted, leaning over the table, both hands occupied pinning Lucas. His center of gravity was heavily pitched forward. Weapons of opportunity. Stainless steel tray. Surgical clamps. A heavy, solid brass oxygen regulator sitting on the counter to her right. "He's crashing," Morgan said. It was a lie. Lucas was bleeding, but his pulse under her hand was still racing. Strong enough. "What?" Vincent demanded, stepping half a pace closer, momentarily dropping his focus to his brother's face. It was a window of a fraction of a second. Morgan didn't freeze, and she didn't telegraph her movement. She just moved. She let go of Lucas's wound entirely. As the blood geysered upward, she dropped her center of gravity, ducking under the line of Vincent's barrel. Her right hand swept across the rolling surgical tray, fingers closing around the heavy stainless steel bone saw, a thick, serrated tool meant for cast removal. In the same fluid motion, she pivoted on her left heel, driving her weight upward. She didn't aim for Vincent's face or the gun. She aimed for the wrist holding the weapon. The solid steel of the saw slammed into the delicate radial bone of Vincent's forearm with a sickening crack. Vincent let out a sharp, breathless gasp. His fingers spasmed open. The gun dropped. Morgan didn't wait to watch it fall. As Vincent reeled backward, clutching his shattered arm, Wyatt roared, lunging across the gurney at her. He was huge, blocking out the light, his massive hands reaching for her throat. Morgan stepped into the attack rather than away from it. It was counterintuitive, violating every instinct a civilian had, but it robbed Wyatt of his momentum. As his thick fingers grazed her collar, she jammed the point of the heavy trauma shears upward, burying them 2 inches into the soft, fleshy hollow of his armpit. The subscapular nerve plexus. Wyatt's entire right side went limp. His eyes bugged out in shock as his body collapsed forward, his chin slamming violently against the steel rim of the gurney. His teeth clicked together with a sound like 2 pool balls colliding. He slumped to the floor, dead weight. Morgan was already moving. She kicked the dropped 9mm pistol under the metal cabinets, completely removing it from play. She stood up, her breathing heavy, ragged. Her scrub top was soaked in Lucas's blood. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't a phantom tremor. It was the raw, chemical burn of pure adrenaline. Vincent was backed into the corner of the small room, his left hand clutching his mangled right wrist. The smug, entitled mask was gone, replaced by naked, wide-eyed shock. He looked at his fallen muscle, then at his brother bleeding out on the table, and finally at the exhausted, blood-soaked woman standing between him and the door. Morgan picked up a fresh pair of hemostats from the tray. She looked at Vincent, her eyes hollow, the exhaustion settling back into her bones. "I told you," Morgan said, her voice barely a whisper over the steady, erratic beeping of the heart monitor she hadn't turned on. "I'm just the night nurse." Vincent stayed pinned against the wall, his expensive overcoat smeared with drywall dust. His breathing came in short, ragged gasps, his teeth grinding together so hard Morgan could hear the click of enamel over the humming fluorescent bulb. He looked down at his ruined right wrist. The skin was already turning a deep plum color where the bone saw had struck. He wasn't an untouchable boss anymore. He was just a terrified man with a fractured radius, trapped in a room that smelled like a slaughterhouse. "Get up," Morgan said. Her voice was stripped of the soft cadence she used for regulars. It was flat, dry, and cold. The tone she used when mortar rounds hit the perimeter wire, and there was no time for fear, only for sorting the living from the dead. Vincent didn't move. His eyes flared at her through a veil of greasy sweat. "You're dead," he whispered, his lip curling. "You don't know who we are. You don't know what happens to people who lay hands on me. Right now, the only person dying in this room is your brother," she said, nodding toward the steel gurney. Lucas was turning the color of wet newspaper. Blood from his mesenteric artery was filling his abdominal cavity, bloating his lower belly under his torn shirt. The heavy dripping on the linoleum had turned into a steady, dark stream flowing towards the floor drain. He was slipping rapidly into stage 4 hemorrhagic shock, his chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate jerks. Morgan didn't wait for compliance. She grabbed a roll of reinforced tape from the wall, the plastic wheels screeching. She dropped to one knee beside Wyatt, who was face down, groaning. The trauma shears were still sticking out of his armpit, the handles twitching with every frantic beat of his heart. She didn't pull them out. Doing so would make him bleed out. Instead, she hauled his left wrist behind his back and wrapped the tape tightly 4 times until his skin went white. She did the same to his ankles, looping the adhesive until he was entirely immobilized. He was heavy, like a sack of grain, and the effort sent a hot needle of pain through her lower back. She ignored it, pushing the discomfort down into the dark box where she kept her memories. She stood up, wiping her palms on her sides, and faced Vincent. "Left hand," she commanded. "What?" Vincent asked, his voice shaking. "Use your left hand. Get over here and hold this flap of skin open. If you don't, he's dead in 2 minutes, and then I don't have a single reason to keep you alive either." The raw utility of the statement hit Vincent like a physical blow. He looked at his brother, then at Morgan's face. There was no anger or heroic defiance in her eyes. There was only the cold, mechanical reality of a triage worker who had seen 100 men dissolve into meat. Vincent stumbled forward, his knees shaking. His shoes slid in the puddle of blood, making a wet, sticky sound. He reached out his left hand, his fingers trembling, and gripped the metal retractor Morgan jammed into his palm. "Pull back," she said, her gloved hands diving into the wound track. "Keep it steady. If you shake, he drowns." The smell was overwhelming now. The heat from the open cavity carried the sour, metallic stench of shredded bowel mixed with the sharpness of iodine. Morgan's fingers were slick. She couldn't feel the pulse anymore. Lucas's blood pressure was dropping too fast. She had to find the leak by touch alone. She reached deeper, her knuckles scraping against the edge of his pelvis. Her mind drifted for a dangerous millisecond back to a shallow trench outside Sangin, her hands buried in the chest of a young corporal while the sky screamed with lead. She shook the memory away. Not now. Not here. She found the artery. It felt like a torn rubber hose, pulsing weakly against her index finger. She slid the large hemostat down her hand and snapped it shut. The rhythmic spurting stopped instantly. "Hold," she muttered, her breath hot against her paper mask. She picked up a second clamp, securing the lower end of the vessel. The bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. Vincent was staring at her hands. His face inches from hers, she smelled his expensive cologne, ruined by terror and copper. "What are you?" He breathed softly, his voice cracking. "You're no nurse." "I'm the person saving your brother's life," she said, pouring sterile saline directly into the wound to wash away the darkness. The clamps held. Lucas's breathing stabilized slightly, a long sigh escaping his blue lips. "And I'm the person who can let him go just as fast." She stepped back, leaving Vincent holding the retractors. Her shoulder muscles burned with tension. She looked at the clock on the wall. 3:32 a.m. Only 18 minutes had passed since they broke the door. It felt like hours. From the front, a frail voice drifted down the hall. "Morgan? Is someone out there? It's getting loud." It was Gary from bed 3. His fever must have broken, or the noise had finally penetrated his heavy sleep. Morgan closed her eyes, the exhaustion hitting like a tidal wave. She took a deep breath, smoothing down her bloody scrub top. "Stay here," she told Vincent, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly quiet registry. "Don't move those clamps. If you move them, he dies, and I'll break your other arm." She walked out of the trauma room, leaving the defeated syndicate boss holding his dying brother's life together with one trembling left hand. The corridor was dark, shadows stretching across cheap linoleum. Morgan walked with a deliberate stride, forcing her heart rate down. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The box breathing technique from her deployments didn't cure the shaking in her knees, but it kept her legs from buckling. She found Gary sitting on his cot, eyes wide in the dim light. He clutched a thin blanket around his bony shoulders, his skin pale under the street lamp glare leaking through the window. "Just some difficult patience, Gary," Morgan said gently, using the comforting tone she kept for the broken. She stood inside the doorway, hiding the blood on her clothes in the shadows. "Someone had an accident outside. We're taking care of it." Sounded like glass. Gary mumbled. Sounded like gunfire. "Just the storm." She lied, handing him a cup of water, her fingers steady. "Drink this. Go back to sleep. The sun will be up soon." Gary drank it down in 3 greedy gulps. He looked up at her, trusting, entirely oblivious to the fact that 10 feet away, 2 men were bound and bleeding on the floor. "Thanks, Morgan. You're a good girl." "Sleep, Gary." She turned back toward the trauma room. The small pocket of warmth she had felt for the old man vanished, replaced by the cold, metallic reality waiting for her. She walked back into the bright light. Vincent hadn't moved an inch. His face was grey now, his left hand locking up from the strain of holding the heavy retractors. Wyatt was still groaning on the floor, his legs twitching fruitlessly against the medical tape. "Here's what's going to happen," Morgan said, standing over the gurney. She grabbed a large needle and nylon suture line. She couldn't properly close his abdomen, but she could tie off the main bleeder and put enough rough stitches in the skin to keep his organs inside until they reached their private doctor. She worked quickly, her fingers moving with brutal efficiency. She shoved Vincent's hand away, her needle piercing flesh with a sharp pop. Vincent watched her, his bravado crushed. He was a man who ruled through fear, but he had just run into someone who had lived inside fear for years. "You're going to take him," Morgan said as she tied the last knot and snapped the thread with her shears. She slapped a thick abdominal pad over the wound and taped it down hard with 3 strips of tape. "You're going to put him in your car, and you're going to drive away." "You're not calling the police?" Vincent asked, his voice low, suspicious, searching her face for a trap. Morgan stopped, her eyes heavy with weariness. If I call the police, this clinic gets cordoned off as a crime scene. The state closes us down for an investigation. Tomorrow, 40 people who need insulin, prenatal vitamins, or clean needles have nowhere to go. They die because of people like you. She grabbed her trauma shears and knelt beside Wyatt. With one quick slice, she cut the tape around his ankles and wrists, leaving the shears resting in his armpit. Get him up. Help him walk. Wyatt rolled over, his face white from pain. He scrambled to his feet, using his good arm to support himself against the wall, looking at Morgan with a fear that was almost childlike. He had never met a woman who could turn his own weight into a weapon. Together, Wyatt and Vincent hauled Lucas off the gurney. Lucas groaned, his feet dragging uselessly on the floor, but the bleeding had stopped. He would live, at least through the night. Vincent stopped at the broken doorway. Cold rain drifted in from the street, misting against his face. He looked back at Morgan, who was already picking up a bucket and a mop. "This isn't over," Vincent said, though the words lacked weight. It sounded like a script he was forced to read, a declaration of pride rather than a promise of vengeance. "It is," Morgan said, without looking up. She plunged the mop into the bucket, the water turning a cloudy, pale pink. "Because if you come back here, I won't use surgical tools. I'll use what I learned before I became a nurse." Vincent stared at her for 5 seconds, searching for a tremor. Finding none, they disappeared into the dark, wet street, the heavy engine of their sedan roaring to life before fading into the city's ambient noise. The clinic grew quiet. Morgan stood in the waiting room, leaning heavily on the mop handle. Her lower back screamed, a white-hot fire making it hard to breathe. Her hands shook violently, the adrenaline finally washing out, leaving a cold, hollow exhaustion. She looked at the broken door frame, the shattered lock hanging by a single screw. She would have to tell the director a drunk patient kicked it in. Another lie, another layer of grease on her soul. She walked back to the nurse's station, dropped into the creaking vinyl chair, and pulled a fresh intake form towards her. She stared at the blank lines. Name, date of birth, reason for visit. She didn't feel heroic. She just felt dirty, tired, and deeply old. She had spent 7 years trying to wash the desert out of her skin, trying to believe a white coat could cover the green uniform. But tonight, the uniform had saved her. That was the worst part. She still knew exactly how to kill. A pale, watery grey light began to bleed through the dirty, frosted windows, slowly illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. The long night shift was finally over. Morgan picked up her black ink pen and slowly began to write. If Morgan's story gripped you, remember that the toughest battles are often fought in the dark by the people we least expect. Hit that like button to support grounded, raw storytelling. Share this video with someone who loves a tense thriller, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deep dive into the shadows of the human soul. Drop a comment below to share your personal thoughts. Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for watching.